Wyoming Territory, late August, 1879. The sun was cruel that day, high and mean, beating down on the dry dirt road that cut through the hills outside Rawlins. And there she was, half conscious in the dust, dress torn, face burned red, boots worn near through. She dropped to her knees first, then folded like a paper doll, crumpling into the gravel with a soft thump. Leona Oakes had not meant to fall. She had meant to keep walking. But her body had given out just 5 steps too soon. A lone rider spotted her from the ridge above, reining in hard. His name was Ledger Boone, and his horse, a sorrel gelding named Flint, snorted as they stared down at the unmoving figure below. "Whoa," Ledger whispered, scanning the road. "No wagon. No supplies. No one else." He dismounted fast, boots hitting the dirt with a short thud, and jogged the last stretch toward her. Up close, she looked even worse, cheeks sunken, lips cracked, the sleeve of her blouse stiff with dried blood near the shoulder. "Miss." He crouched, palm flat to her back. "Warm. Still breathing." She stirred just a little. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Ledger did not waste time. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her up. She was light, too light, and carried her to Flint. She barely woke when he swung into the saddle behind her, holding her steady against his chest. It was a hard ride back to his ranch. The wind kicked up dust, and the sun dropped slow behind the hills. But he kept one arm around her the whole way, steady and sure. She woke 2 days later in a quiet room with white curtains and the smell of coffee and horsehair in the air. Her shoulder ached, but it was clean, bandaged. Her mouth tasted like chalk, but there was water near the bed. Ledger was sitting in the corner, boot propped on his knee, sharpening a knife. She blinked at him. "Where am I?" He looked up, calm. "Safe." "How long?" "Since I found you?" "2 days." She tried to sit up, but winced. I had to keep walking." She swallowed, eyes darting around like she was looking for something that might not be there. "You do not have to explain anything just yet," Ledger said gently, setting the knife down. "You are hurt. You need rest." "I am not staying." He nodded like he expected that. "You are free to go whenever you can stand. But until then, you are not walking anywhere." She stared at him. He was tall, sun-worn, with dark blonde hair that curled under his hat brim and quiet eyes the color of river stone. Not young, but not old either. Maybe 30. His voice was steady, no edge to it. "I do not know your name," she said finally. "Ledger Boone. This is my ranch." She hesitated. "Leona Oakes." His brow lifted slightly. "You got family nearby, Leona?" She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting in the blanket. "Not anymore." He did not ask more. Just stood and poured her a cup of water, then brought it to her bedside. She drank slow, eyes on him the whole time. By the 4th day, she was sitting up on the porch wrapped in his old coat, watching the hills. Her wound was healing. A clean cut, not too deep, looked like a blade. He had not asked. Ledger came out with coffee and 2 tin mugs, handing her one as he sat beside her. "Looks better today," he said. She nodded. "It does." They sat in silence, the wind moving through the grass. A hawk circled high overhead. "I had not eaten in 2 days," she said quietly. "Before you found me." Ledger looked over, but said nothing. "I kept walking anyway. I thought maybe there would be a town. Maybe someone who would not ask questions." "You found someone," he said. She gave a small breath of a laugh. "Yes. You." They sat a while longer. "I was the daughter of a man no one remembered," she said. "He died in prison last winter. Mama passed before that. My uncle. Well, he was not the kind of man you stay near if you want to wake up safe." Ledger's fists clenched around his mug, but he kept his voice calm. "So you left?" "I ran. Took the road west. Thought maybe I could reach Utah. Or Idaho. I do not even know anymore." "You were not going to make it," he said softly. "I know." Another silence. Then she turned to him. "Why did you help me?" He looked at her, steady and sure. "Because you needed help." She watched him for a long time. "You were a stranger. You were dying." Their eyes held. By the end of the week, she was helping in the kitchen, moving slow but steady. He had a housekeeper who came twice a week, but otherwise Ledger lived alone. No wife, no children. Just the quiet land, his horses, and the wind. "You have always been alone?" she asked one evening. "My folks passed when I was 20. My brother died in a mining collapse. I guess I got used to quiet." She set a plate down in front of him. "I do not like quiet." "No? I like voices. Laughter. Company." "Well," he said, looking up at her with a small smile, "you can talk as much as you want here." She smiled back, a little surprised at herself. One morning, she woke before him and stepped outside. The sun was just rising, pink and gold over the hills. Ledger came out a few minutes later, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You all right?" She nodded. "I have not felt this all right in a long time." He looked at her for a moment, then stepped closer. "Leona." She turned to him. "I do not know what you want from here on. I do not know if you are staying or going. But if you stay, I would be real glad." She stared at him, heart hammering. "You do not owe me anything," he added. "But I care about you. I want you safe. And I want you here." Tears welled in her eyes. Not from sadness. Something else. "I want to stay," she whispered. Ledger stepped closer, reached out gently, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. She leaned into his hand. And just like that, some weight inside her shifted. The road behind her was done. The road ahead? It was here. With him. With Ledger Boone. And neither of them was alone anymore. The fence line had sagged some near the southern pasture, and Ledger leaned into the work with quiet focus, hammering in new cedar posts while flint grazed nearby. The sun hung low as afternoon stretched toward evening, air thick with the scent of turned earth and late summer grass. From the rise above, Leona approached with a small pail of water and a folded cloth over her arm. Her gait was steadier now, though she still favored her left side. She didn't call out, just waited until he looked up. "I brought this," she said, offering the pail. Ledger set his hammer on the post and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "You didn't need to come all the way down." "I wanted to," she said, glancing at the crooked posts near the creek bed. "That one's leaning." He followed her gaze and nodded. "Frost heave last winter. Thought I'd fix it before the cold comes again." "Ground's still soft enough." She dipped the cloth in the water and pressed it into his hand. "Your cheek's bleeding." Ledger touched his face and frowned at the smear of blood on his fingers. "Barbed wire caught me, I guess." She stepped closer and reached up, dabbing gently. "Hold still." He did. Her touch was careful, her brows drawn in concentration. When she finished, she stepped back, suddenly aware of how near they stood. "You always do everything yourself?" she asked, voice quieter now. "Mostly," he said. "Not much need for hired hands this time of year. Winter's when it gets busier. I could help." She looked toward the barn, then back to him. "I can sew, mend, tack, cook. I'm no use to anyone sitting up in that house." His gaze held hers. "You're not a burden, Leona." "I didn't say I was. I said I'd rather be useful." He studied her for a moment. "All right. We'll start with the tack room tomorrow. Need sorting." She gave a small nod, satisfied. They walked back together, the silence between them companionable now. A hawk wheeled above the ridge, and the wind carried the sound of distant cattle lowing. At the porch steps, she paused. "You said your brother worked in a mine?" "South of Laramie," he said. "Coal shaft collapsed. He was 26. She nodded slowly. "My father spent 2 years at Leavenworth. I don't even know what for. Mama never said." Ledger didn't press her. They stood side by side in the fading light. "You were right about the frost heave," she said after a while. "I saw it up in Cheyenne too. Houses splitting along the foundation." He turned to her, brow raised. "You've been to Cheyenne?" "Once," she said. "Rode in a freight wagon with a friend of Mama's. She thought there'd be work for me at a boarding house. There wasn't." Ledger leaned against the porch rail, arms folded. "What happened to her?" "She stayed. Married a man who ran a livery. I left before winter." "You've seen more of the territory than most," he said. She looked out across the pasture. "I saw enough to know where I didn't belong." Ledger didn't answer. but his expression shifted, something quiet and steady passing through his eyes. Later, after they'd eaten, he stepped out to check the corral gate. Leona stayed behind and cleared the table, her hands moving slow but sure. The rhythm of domestic work grounded her, gave her breath she hadn't felt in months. When he returned, she was folding a dish towel by lamplight. "I've been thinking," he said, closing the door behind him, "about the north pasture." She looked up. "There's a stretch of land beyond the cottonwoods. Flat and dry, but it might hold a garden if we rig a line from the well." "You want to plant something?" she asked, surprised. "I thought you might," he said. "Come spring." Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. "I don't know much about it," he went on, "but I figure we could learn." She stepped toward him, slow and deliberate, then reached for his hand. "No one's ever offered me land before." His fingers curled around hers, warm and calloused. "It's not just the land." "I know." They stood there, the oil lamp casting soft light over the worn floorboards. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. Inside, something else shifted, quiet and certain. They didn't speak again that night, but when he passed her in the hall, her fingertips brushed his wrist. A silent promise, light as breath. And when he turned in, he left the door not quite closed. The first frost came early that year, laying a silver skin over the pasture and turning the creek stones to glass before sunrise. Leona stood by the barn door, pulling on gloves Ledger had found in a trunk under the stairs, too big in the fingers, but warm enough. She watched her breath rise in front of her and listened to the sound of leather tack creaking inside. Ledger emerged from the stall with a curry brush in one hand. "You ever worked a horse through winter?" "No," she said, walking toward him. "But I've slept through one with a cracked roof and a broken stove." He chuckled low. "Then you'll do fine." He handed her a brush and nodded toward the filly waiting in the next stall. "She's new to the saddle. We'll need her steady by spring." Leona stepped into the stall. The filly's eyes followed her, ears flicking. "She's skittish," Ledger said, leaning on the stall door. "Don't crowd her." "I wouldn't," she murmured. She held out her hand, still and patient, letting the filly sniff her fingers before moving closer. "What's her name?" "Didn't give her one yet." "She's got a nervous heart," Leona said, brushing slow down the filly's shoulder. "But she wants to trust." Ledger watched her, arms folded. "You see that just from a look? I know what it's like to wait for someone to be kind." Something quiet passed through his expression, but he didn't speak. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the brushing of coats and the soft shift of hoofs. When they stepped out into the yard, the wind had picked up, carrying the brittle scent of dry pine. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, tugging her coat tighter. "Not in years," he replied, walking beside her toward the woodpile. "I went as far as Kansas when I was 20. Didn't find anything worth staying for." She picked up a short-handled axe and tested its weight. "So you came back." "I came home." She set a log on the stump and split it clean. "I don't have a place like that." "You might." They stacked the cut wood in a canvas-lined crate before heading back toward the house. The kitchen windows glowed with firelight, and the smell of dried sage drifted from the lean to where she'd hung bundles to cure. Inside, she stirred the pot on the stove while Ledger laid out the tin plates. A rabbit stew thickened with onion and beans simmered low, and she tasted it once before setting the spoon down. "You always this quiet?" she asked, handing him a cloth for his hands. He thought a moment. "Talk's useful when it means something, not when it's just noise." She smiled faintly. "Then you'll get along with me just fine." They ate in the hush of early dark, the fire snapping in the hearth. Afterward, she brought out the mended saddlebag she'd been working on and settled near the flames. Ledger sat across from her, his chair creaking under his weight as he leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Did you ever want children?" he asked, tone even. She looked up slowly. "Yes." "You think you still might?" Her hands stilled on the stitching. "I think I'd like to know what it's like to raise a child in a house without fear." He nodded once, then leaned back. That's a good answer. She set the bag aside. What about you? Never thought I'd have someone to raise one with. The firelight played across his face, warm against the sharp lines of his jaw and the quiet thoughtfulness in his eyes. She rose and crossed to him, kneeling beside his chair. I want to stay, Ledger, she said, voice steady. Not just for winter. I want to build something here. With you. His hand found hers, rough palm warm against her skin. Then we will. They sat like that until the fire burned low, her head resting against his knee, his fingers brushing slow through her hair. Outside, the wind shifted again, but inside, everything held. Nothing rushed, nothing uncertain, only the slow, certain shape of something lasting, quietly taking root. The first snow came soft and early, dusting the roof like flour sifted through an old sieve. Leona stood at the window, shawl drawn tight over her shoulders, watching the flakes settle on the fence rails and the backs of cattle hunched against the cold. Ledger was out in the barn, fitting canvas covers over the hay bales. She turned from the window and laid another log on the stove, nudging it into place with the iron poker. The room warmed quick, but some part of her still felt the cold in her ribs, like it had settled there years ago and never quite left. The door creaked open. Ledger stepped in, brushing snow from his hat. They're holding close to the lean-to. I'll check on them again after supper. You'll be soaked through by then, she said, crossing to him with a towel. He didn't argue. Let her press the wool to his shoulders, then took it to dry his hands. I saw a fox near the fence line, he said, looking lean. They'll be bold this winter, she said. Too many dry months. He set his hat on the peg and looked at her with quiet thought. You know how to trap? I do. You want to show me? She nodded, slow and certain. Tomorrow. Early. That night, after the lamps were turned down low, they sat close in the parlor, the fire licking low in the hearth. Ledger held a worn book in his hands, the cover softened with age. He opened it and handed it to her. Found this in the attic. Belonged to my mother. She marked some pages. Leona turned the brittle leaves with care. Inside were pressed flowers, faded ribbons, and neat lines of script in a woman's hand. She had gentle thoughts, Leona said after reading a few passages. There's patience in her words. She grew up in Tennessee, Ledger said. Came west with my father in a wagon train. Lost 2 brothers on the trail. She never talked much about it, but she wrote. Always wrote. She must have loved this place to stay. She did. Said Wyoming had a kind of silence that made room for memory. Leona closed the book and looked up at him. I think I'd have liked her. I think she'd have liked you. They went quiet then, not out of discomfort but because no more needed saying. Outside, the wind pulled at the eaves. Inside, the fire settled into coals. In the gray light before dawn, Leona led Ledger beyond the cottonwoods, where the snow came thinner and the ground held the prints of small things. She showed him how to set a snare using a bent sapling and a length of wire she'd found in the shed. If the loop's too wide, it won't catch, she said, crouching low as she worked. And if it's too tight, they'll break free before the sapling springs. He knelt beside her, watching close. You learned this from your father? No. From a woman in Nebraska. She was half Lakota, ran a laundry outside Fort Robinson. Taught me a great many things. Ledger glanced at her. You've had to learn from all sorts. She stood, brushing snow from her skirt. I never had the luxury of staying in one place long enough to forget. They set 3 snares in the underbrush before heading back. The sun was up now, turning the snow to gold. Leona paused just before the rise, her breath clouding the air. I used to think I was meant to disappear, she said. That whatever name I had would vanish with me. Ledger reached for her hand, his grip firm through the wool of her glove. You're not disappearing, Leona. Not with me. She held his gaze. Then I'll build something here. Not just help. Not just pass through. He nodded once. Then we'll build it together. Back at the house, she peeled potatoes while he split kindling by the root cellar. The day passed quiet, and when evening came, they sat down to a simple meal: salt pork, bread, stewed apples. The kind of supper that made a home feel full. Later, she lit the lamp in the bedroom and turned down the quilt. Ledger stood in the doorway watching her with a look that held no urgency, just steady warmth. "I've been thinking about spring," he said. She turned. "What about it?" "There's a circuit preacher who rides through in April. Stops in Rollins, sometimes here if he's asked." "What are you asking, Ledger?" He stepped into the room, slow and sure. "That we ask him to stop here. That we make a life together proper." Leona didn't answer right away. She walked to him, placed her hand against his chest where his heart beat steady beneath his shirt. "Yes," she said. "We'll ask him." He took her hand in both of his. Neither of them looked away. And in that quiet room, beneath the soft hum of wind and fire, they knew the road behind them was over. What lay ahead was theirs, built not from what had been taken, but from what they chose to give. The wind had softened by March, no longer sharp enough to bite, just cool enough to keep the earth waiting. Ledger stood at the edge of the western rise, surveying the shallow trench he'd dug along the slope. Leona joined him with a tin of seeds wrapped in oilcloth, her boots muddy to the ankle. "This roll'll get the last of the meltwater," he said, adjusting the brim of his hat. "If we plant here, sun'll reach it first." Leona handed him the seed tin. "I saved the beans from last year's stew. They'll take if the frost stays gone." He crouched beside the trench, pressing his palm into the soil. "Still damp underneath." "That's good." She knelt beside him, and they worked in unison, him breaking the ground, her pressing seeds into the furrows. No words passed between them, but there was ease in the silence, a rhythm built over winter. When the last seed was covered, she rose and brushed her hands on her skirt. "I never thought I'd look forward to planting anything." Ledger stood with her, his hands dirt-streaked. "I never thought I'd have someone beside me who knew how." They walked back to the house slow, the sky pale gold above the cottonwoods. A rabbit darted across their path and vanished into the brush. Just beyond the barn, a new structure had begun to take shape, a small lean-to with a sloped roof and a window facing east. Leona gestured toward it. "You're not building that for the tools." "No. I thought it might suit a sewing room." She paused. "You didn't ask if I wanted one. I figured you'd tell me if I was wrong." She looked at the half-framed doorway, then back at him. "You're not wrong." Inside, the house had changed in quiet ways. Her sewing box rested by the hearth. A second coat hung by the door. The bed had been moved to the east room, where morning light spilled across the quilt she'd pieced through January. Ledger poured water into the kettle and set it over the stove. "The preacher wired from Green River. He'll ride through in 2 weeks." Leona dried her hands on a linen cloth. "And you're sure?" He met her eyes. "I've never been more." The first peach blossoms bloomed before the preacher arrived, pink against the bare-limbed trees that bordered the trail. Ledger wore his best shirt, the collar starched stiff, and Leona's dress was cotton calico with a patched hem she'd mended that morning. The ceremony was held beneath the cottonwoods. Just them, the preacher, and the wind. No applause, no music, only the quiet sound of their vows spoken firm and clear. When it was done, Ledger reached for her hand, and she didn't hesitate. That night, they sat on the porch, the oil lamp glowing warm through the window behind them. Ledger rested his arm along the back of her chair. Leona leaned into him, her head beneath his chin. "You ever think about naming this place?" she asked. "I did." "And?" "Stone Hollow. Thought of it after that frost passed. Everything held. Nothing broke." She nestled closer, her voice softer now. "Then Stone Hollow it is." Through spring, they shaped a life that didn't feel borrowed. She stitched curtains for the sewing room and dried wild mint for tea. He taught her how to set a line for trout, and she showed him how to patch his own shirts when the cuffs frayed. They cleared a second plot for vegetables, and when the rain came, they stood under the lean-to and watched it soak the earth shoulder to shoulder. By midsummer, the garden was heavy with green. Beans climbed the trellis, and the squash blossoms opened wide at dawn. One morning, Leona stood at the sink, her hands resting low over her belly. She didn't speak, just turned to Ledger where he sat mending a bridle. He looked up, then stood. "You're certain?" She nodded, tears rising but not falling. He crossed to her, cupped her face in both hands, and kissed her like a man who knew what it meant to be entrusted with something lasting. They didn't talk about the years before the ranch. Not often. The past stayed where it belonged behind them. But sometimes when the wind moved just right and the silence of dusk settled deep, Leona would reach for his hand and hold it tight, and Ledger would press a kiss to her knuckles, and neither of them had to say they were still grateful. They knew. When their daughter came the following spring, she was born just after the last snow melted, her first breath taken beneath the beams of the room Ledger had built with his own hands. They named her Clara after a name Leona had carried since childhood, tucked away for when there was finally peace enough to use it. Ledger held her first, wrapped in a blanket Leona had stitched through the long winter evenings. He looked at his daughter's face, then at the woman beside him, and said, quiet and sure, she'll have a good life. She already does, Leona whispered. Years passed. The garden grew. So did the house. The sewing room became a nursery, then a schoolroom. Leona taught Clara her letters at the kitchen table, and Ledger taught her how to ride. They didn't speak of hardship not because it hadn't shaped them, but because it no longer defined them. Stone Hollow stood through every season, and within its walls, the love Ledger and Leona built never loosened its roots. It held through storms. It held through growth. It held through time. And each evening, when the sun dropped low and the sky turned to fire, they sat side by side on the porch, hands clasped, hearts steady, watching the land they'd claimed not by force, but by faith in each other, in what they'd sown, and in the quiet strength of love that never faltered.